The morning air smelled of smoke and dust. Broken buildings lined the streets. Ash fell like rain. Somewhere a child cried, but no one turned. On a rough wooden plank, a woman knelt. Her wrists were bound with ropes that had cut into her skin. Her eyes were wide, staring at nothing. Beside her, other women stood in a long line, their faces pale, their clothes torn, their hair tangled. Some clutched children, others held each other by the shoulder, seeking comfort that did not come. A group of men in shadow counted coins, flicking their eyes over the women as if examining cattle. This was not an accident. This was not unusual. This was history. For centuries, in wars across the ancient world, women captured during battles were treated as property. They were cataloged, measured, and sold. Their freedom had been stripped before the sun even rose. The war had ended only hours before. Smoke still rose from burned homes. Soldiers moved through the ruins, their weapons slick with blood. They searched not for enemies, but for survivors, specifically women and children. Some women tried to hide in cellars or under rubble. Some held infants tightly to their chests, but hiding meant nothing. Soldiers dragged them out, ripped them from hiding, tied their wrists, and forced them into lines. There were no names called, no questions asked. Their identities were irrelevant. Only their age, strength, and physical condition mattered. Some women screamed, some wept silently, some stared blankly at the ground. Every moment stretched longer than the last, as if the world itself held its breath. This was how wars in the ancient Roman world ended for many women, not with freedom, but with chains. This was not rumor or legend. Archaeology and historical records confirm it. Roman historians such as Livy and Cassius Dio described cities captured after campaigns where thousands of women were enslaved. Inscriptions from Pompeii and Herculaneum list women alongside household goods like furniture or livestock. Legal documents and papyri from Egypt record sales contracts, noting age, skills, and sometimes reproductive value. Archaeological finds include shackles, weights, and wooden pens used to hold captives before transport. Even tiny personal items, shoes, hairpins, fragments of clothing have been found in the ruins of military camps and frontier towns, hinting at the lives of women who were taken. The evidence is clear. Women were treated as property, and markets existed to distribute them. At the edge of the burned village, a makeshift market had been set up. Wooden tables, ropes, and small platforms formed a stage for the grim business. Soldiers and merchants, some from distant lands, gathered around. Their eyes were calm, practiced. They had seen this before. The women were pushed forward, one by one. Their hands were tied, their hair cut in some cases to make them easier to handle. A soldier would call out the age, health, and skills of each woman. Sometimes he mentioned their family status or whether they could have children. Buyers murmured, nodded, and raised their hands to offer coins. Some came to choose workers for household tasks. Others sought concubines or servants. Occasionally, a man purchased both a woman and her child, ignoring the screams and protests. The market was quiet, except for the sound of coins clinking and ropes tightening. No one asked if the women consented. No one questioned the morality. In that moment, the system of war, property, and control was complete. This was not CE show the scale of these practices. Thousands were enslaved. Women and children were cataloged and distributed across the empire. Victory parades in Rome often displayed the captives before citizens as trophies of conquest. The process was organized. Soldiers recorded their share of captives. Merchants prepared transportation. Legal frameworks ensured the captives could be sold, rented, or assigned to households. Every step was documented in stone, papyrus, and inscriptions. There was no mystery. The suffering was official. The commodification of women was normalized. Behind the numbers and records were real lives. Women lost their families, homes, and freedom. Children were torn from their mothers. Many were forced into domestic labor, others into sexual servitude, and some into public spectacles like games or funerals. Osteoarchaeological studies reveal the physical toll. Marks on bones show repeated pregnancies, malnutrition, and trauma. The human body itself recorded the exploitation that history sometimes only hints at. Some women resisted, some tried to escape, some waited for freedom through manumission or rebellion. But for most, the world of chains, markets, and legal property rules defined their lives. While some Roman writers criticized the abuses, most society accepted them. Law, culture, and economy intertwined to make women invisible in legal terms. A master's rights included control over their bodies. Even moralists who denounced excess in elite households did not challenge the system itself. Inscriptions and papyri show this clearly. Women were property. Their lives were accounted for in economic terms. Their names, when recorded, were secondary to their value. It is easy to forget this when we read history in textbooks, but archaeology, skeletal studies, and documents reveal the truth. Countless women were captured, sold, and forced to serve, often for their entire lives. As the sun set over the destroyed village, wagons carried the last of the captives away. Some went to private homes. Some were sent to cities hundreds of miles away. Some would never see their families again. The dust settled. The market emptied. The village remained in ruins, but the echoes of that morning, screams, chains, and coins, lingered, etched into history. For these women, the war never ended. Their struggle was silent, invisible, and recorded only in fragments, in stones, papyri, inscriptions, and bones. But their story survives. Their pain, their fear, and their courage are etched into the record. They remind us that history is not only about victories and empires. It is about the lives caught between swords and coins, waiting, praying, surviving.
The dust from the morning battles had barely settled. The women, who had survived the capture, who had walked silently through the market with ropes cutting their wrists, were now being examined, listed, and sold. A soldier called out details about one woman, her age, her strength, her skills. A scribe wrote it down carefully, like inventory for a warehouse. Another woman, younger, watched as her friend was dragged forward. Her eyes filled with tears, but she dared not cry. Crying would only make her more visible, more valuable, or more doomed. These marketplaces were not just temporary spaces. They were part of a system that stretched across the empire. Archaeologists have found wooden pens, metal shackles, and lists of captives in ruins from Britain to Egypt. Every artifact tells the same story. Women were property, and their lives were measured in coins and contracts. In Rome, official records describe entire cities emptied of their women after military campaigns. The sack of Corinth in 146 BCE provides one of the clearest examples. Thousands of women were taken, marched to markets, and distributed among soldiers and merchants. The accounts are precise. Age, appearance, skills, and sometimes reproductive potential were noted. These were not exaggerations. Inscriptions from Pompeii and Herculaneum list women alongside furniture, livestock, and other goods. Their value was economic, not human. Some historians tried to justify it. They said it was natural for victors to claim spoils. Others criticized it, but their words often went unheard. Elite writers documented these acts in poems and histories, noting both the exploitation and the moral decay they observed. Juvenal, writing in the 1st century CE, mocked the corruption of Roman society. Tacitus described imperial households taking captives after triumphs. The condemnation existed, but the practice persisted. Back in the market, a mother held her child close as a buyer examined her. The child's small hands clutched her mother's robes. A merchant whispered a price for the woman. He wanted her for domestic work, perhaps for sexual labor. The mother's body trembled, not only from fear, but from the knowledge that her child's fate would also be decided here. This was not unusual. Roman law ensured that the status of the mother determined the status of the child. Children born to enslaved women were also enslaved, bound by the same chains that held their mothers. Inscriptions and papyri from Roman Egypt provide glimpses of the contracts that formalized this system. Some documents record the sale of a young woman for her skills in weaving or cooking. Others mention her age, her health, and sometimes her fertility. Skeletal studies confirm these roles. Many women show signs of repeated childbirth, nutritional stress, and trauma. Their bodies became a resource, measured and valued for labor and reproduction. The marketplace was only the first step. Once sold, these women were sent to households, workshops, and even gladiatorial arenas. In villas across the empire, inventories list female slaves as cooks, wet nurses, concubines, and textile workers. Archaeological evidence, loom weights, dye pits, kitchen utensils correspond with these roles. The work was relentless. Long hours, constant oversight, and little respite became the norm. Even medical care reflected this utilitarian approach. Physicians such as Serenus and Galen wrote about the health of women, noting differences between citizens and slaves. Treatments were often pragmatic, aimed at maintaining productivity rather than comfort. Obstetric care for enslaved women was intended to preserve fertility, not to reduce suffering. Their value was tied to their ability to bear children and perform labor. Public spectacle also reinforced control. Women were displayed during triumphs, executed in arenas, or forced to participate in games. Reliefs and mosaics show bound women paraded before crowds. The amphitheater itself became a stage for both punishment and exhibition. Skeletal remains from mass burials near these sites often show trauma patterns consistent with forced marches, captivity, and violence. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a system that normalized the objectification of women. Resistance was possible but rare. Some women escaped or petitioned for manumission. Papyri from Egypt record appeals to officials for protection or freedom. These documents reveal agency within extreme constraint. Freed women often took new names, started households, and occasionally engaged in small-scale commerce. Yet even manumission could not erase the stigma of past enslavement. Freed women's lives remained shaped by the system that had first captured them. Religion intersected with captivity as well. Some women were dedicated to temple service, becoming religious servants. Inscriptions and temple records note these assignments. Though framed as piety, these roles were another form of control, embedding captive women into the religious and social economy. Military colonies also absorbed captives. After campaigns, veterans received land allocations that included human property. Inscriptions and tablets show women being assigned to households often far from their homes. Archaeology of frontier settlements reveals rapid demographic changes, suggesting how the distribution of captives reshaped communities. Women became laborers, concubines, or matrons in new households, altering social and gender hierarchies in the provinces. Funerary evidence sometimes provides rare personal glimpses. Epitaphs and cemeteries record names, origins, and roles of women, including former captives who became freed women. Skeletal analysis reveals health histories, childbirth markers, dental wear from labor, and healed trauma. Together, these traces allow reconstruction of life courses and suggest how some women navigated paths from bondage to limited autonomy. By examining marketplaces, contracts, and household roles, it becomes clear that the commodification of women was deeply embedded in Roman society. Law, economy, and culture intersected to maintain this system. Women were visible in markets, invisible in law, and exploited in both private and public spaces. Their bodies, labor, and reproduction became tools for economic and social control, shaping families, households, and population structures across the empire. As the sun set, the market emptied. Women were taken to distant villas, workshops, and ports. Some would spend their lives as laborers. Others would bear children who inherited their status. The marketplace itself, a place of fear, evaluation, and decision, faded from view, but its consequences stretched across generations. In the end, Chapter 2 reveals a chilling truth. The sale of women was not random or chaotic. It was organized, structured, and supported by law, custom, and social acceptance. Their lives were cataloged, priced, and distributed. And though some resisted, most were absorbed into a system that measured them by labor and fertility, not by humanity. The chain of market, law, and labor continued to shape the lives of captured women, leaving traces in documents, bones, and memories that history has preserved. This is only the beginning. The next chapters will explore the law that formalized control, the daily labor of captive women, and the moral and cultural forces that justified or condemned their exploitation.
The law was silent about the pain of women. It spoke only in property, contracts, and ownership. After battles ended, after captives were marched and sold, the Roman legal system stepped in, not to protect, but to formalize control. Women captured in war were not citizens. They were not individuals with rights. They were property, objects whose lives could be bought, sold, or assigned. The law ensured this. Roman jurists like Gaius in the 2nd century CE wrote clearly, slaves had no personhood. They could not consent. Their masters had complete authority over their bodies and labor. Legal texts, later compiled in the Digest under Emperor Justinian, preserved these opinions. Every case, every contract, every rule made it clear a woman captured in war was legally invisible. The legal machinery went beyond words. Contracts recorded sales with astonishing detail. Papyri from Roman Egypt list women's ages, skills, and reproductive potential. A 17-year-old woman might be valued for her strength in weaving. A 20-year-old might be priced for fertility. Even children were bound by these rules. Status followed the mother. A baby born to a captive mother was also a slave. Law, economy, and biology intersected to make human lives a commodity. The marketplace, as brutal as it was, operated under these rules. Soldiers and merchants could rely on legal backing for their purchases. A buyer who took a woman home could enforce his rights through the courts. Conversely, masters had the right to punish, discipline, and exploit without fear of legal consequences. The law made abuse routine rather than exceptional. Some women tried to resist. Papyri revealed petitions from enslaved individuals seeking relief, better treatment, or freedom. But resistance faced immense obstacles. The law rarely favored the petitioner. Even when freedom was granted, social stigma and legal obligations remained. Freed women often owed years of service to their former masters or were bound by patronage. Autonomy was possible, but always constrained. Roman law also intersected with social norms. Elite masculinity demanded control over women's bodies. Soldiers, magistrates, and citizens viewed the ownership of women, whether captured in war or born into slavery, as a mark of status and honor. The law reinforced this ideology. Sexual access to captive women, participation in household labor, and control over reproduction were normalized. Legal codes codified societal expectations, making oppression lawful. Yet not all elite writers agreed with these practices. Philosophers, moralists, and poets sometimes criticized the system. Seneca, in his letters, condemned excessive cruelty, while Juvenal satirized the corruption of Roman society. Tacitus documented abuses within imperial households. Still, criticism often focused on excess or moral decay, not on the legality of slavery itself. The law remained unmoved. Archaeology mirrors this reality. Inscriptions record sales, punishments, and manumissions. Household records list women as cooks, concubines, or wet nurses. Papyri from Oxyrhynchus and Tebtunis show births registered by masters, not mothers. Osteoarchaeology confirms repeated pregnancies, malnutrition, and trauma in women's skeletons. Legal control and physical consequences intersected. Law was not abstract, it shaped bodies and lives. Even medicine reflected this hierarchy. Physicians like Soranus and Galen wrote treatments with distinction between citizens and enslaved women. Obstetric care was pragmatic, to preserve fertility, maintain labor capacity, and prevent economic loss. Health was property management. Women's well-being was secondary to their productivity. Public and private spaces reinforced this control. Women were not only sold, they were displayed. Triumphs paraded captives before Rome's citizens. Games and spectacles included women as objects of punishment, entertainment, and exhibition. The law ensured that these acts were sanctioned, even celebrated. Reliefs, mosaics, and inscriptions confirm this visibility. Women bound, marched, and catalogued. Resistance continued despite the weight of law. Some women escaped, some appealed to officials, and some eventually gained manumission. Documents preserve these stories in fragments. A petition might succeed, granting temporary relief or freedom. A freed woman could establish a household, raise children, or participate in commerce. But social barriers and legal constraints limited the reach of this autonomy. Freedom existed, but full equality did not. Religion intersected with law as well. Captive women were sometimes dedicated to temple service, creating a legal and spiritual framework for their exploitation. Inscriptions note slaves assigned to cult duties. Temples administered property, and captive women became part of that structure. Law and ritual reinforced each other, embedding women in hierarchies that blurred ownership, duty, and devotion. Military colonies further extended these laws. After campaigns, veterans received plots of land, often with human property attached. Women were part of these allocations, moved from cities to new colonies, assigned to households or sold to settle debts. Archaeological evidence in frontier settlements show rapid demographic shifts. Legal control ensured that women could not escape these structures. Funerary evidence offers rare personal glimpses. Epitaphs sometimes list names, origins, and services of women who were once captives. Skeletal analysis shows stress from childbirth, nutrition, and labor. These records, combined with legal documents, allow reconstruction of life courses. Law dictated the framework, but traces of personal experience survive in bones, inscriptions, and papyri. By formalizing ownership, law transformed chaos into a system. Markets, contracts, household records, and inscriptions were all connected. Each law, each document reinforced the cycle: capture, sale, labor, reproduction, and control. Women were visible in public markets, invisible in the eyes of the law, and fully controlled in both private and social spaces. The consequences were profound. Population structures, household composition, and social hierarchies all shifted according to legal definitions. Women became nodes in a vast network of property and labor. Their bodies, their labor, and their reproduction were regulated, documented, and commodified. As the sun set over the empire, law ensured that the system endured. Markets closed, but contracts persisted. Soldiers returned to barracks, but records persisted. Captive women, bound physically and legally, faced a world where every movement, every birth, and every action was controlled by law and custom. Chapter 3 demonstrates a chilling reality. Roman law did not merely tolerate exploitation of women. It organized, enforced, and normalized it. It shaped bodies, minds, and society itself. Understanding the law is understanding the chains. Without these rules, the market would have been chaos. With them, it became a machine. The next chapter will explore the daily lives of captive women, their work, suffering, and rare glimpses of resistance within households, workshops, and public spaces. We will see how law and labor intertwined to define a life measured in duty, chains, and reproductive potential.
The day began early, long before the sun rose over the city walls. Captive women awoke in small, crowded quarters, the air thick with smoke and the scent of straw and cooking fires. Their wrists bore the faint redness of rope from the march, their eyes heavy from fear and exhaustion. The first task was always the same: labor. In Roman households, workshops, and villas, women were assigned roles according to skill, age, and perceived value. Some worked as cooks, grinding grain and preparing meals for the family and servants. Others tended children, bathing them, teaching them, feeding them, though they themselves had often lost their own families in war. Textile production consumed many, spinning, weaving, dyeing fabrics from dawn to dusk. Looms clacked, hands moved tirelessly, fingers raw from repetitive work. Every thread was measured, accounted for, tied to contracts and household economy. Some women were assigned to sexual labor, whether as concubines or domestic servants. Roman law granted masters total authority, and sexual access was a legal right. These assignments were rarely optional. The law combined with custom and forced compliance. Yet even within these constraints, women found ways to navigate their circumstances. Small acts of agency persisted, slowing work to preserve strength, hiding objects of value, teaching children discreetly, or exchanging whispered knowledge and warnings with other women. Archaeology reveals the physical traces of these lives. Loom weights, spindle whorls, cooking pots, and dye pits survive in excavated villas, workshops, and domestic quarters. Inscriptions record household inventories, often listing women alongside tools, livestock, and furniture. Papyri from Egypt include letters, birth registrations, and contracts that detail labor expectations. Osteoarchaeology confirms intense physical workloads, changes in bones consistent with repetitive labor, healed injuries from accidents or punishment, and markers of repeated childbirth. Nutrition was limited. Meals were functional, designed to sustain labor, not comfort or health. Skeletal analysis shows signs of malnutrition, enamel hypoplasia, stunted growth, and weakened bone structures. Stress markers appear alongside evidence of repeated pregnancies. A woman might give birth 3 or 4 times before reaching her 30s, her body continually pressed into service. Her reproductive value was part of her economic worth, documented in sales records, papyri, and contracts. Despite the harshness, women developed networks of survival.
Bonds formed quietly, shared meals, whispered advice, mutual protection against abusive overseers. These connections were fragile but vital. Letters from Roman Egypt show appeals and petitions sent on behalf of enslaved women, sometimes aided by fellow captives or sympathetic outsiders. Even in the smallest gestures, teaching a secret skill, hiding a token, or providing comfort, women exercised subtle resistance. Punishment were ever present. Law permitted corporal discipline, and masters enforced obedience with beatings, branding, or deprivation. Skeletal evidence shows healed fractures and blunt force trauma. Yet punishment also created knowledge. Women learned patterns, predicting danger, evading abuse where possible, and using compliance strategically. Survival was a daily negotiation between force and subtle cunning. Children of captive women occupied an especially complicated space. Status followed the mother, meaning most children were born into slavery. Their upbringing intertwined with labor expectations, assisting in weaving, childcare, or household chores from a young age. Mothers sought to protect their children, teaching skills and survival strategies to give them slight advantages in a constrained world. Legal documents record the births, sometimes the manumission, and occasionally the extraordinary cases of petitioning for freedom. Even public spectacle touched daily life. Captive women might be paraded during festivals, triumphs, or games. Reliefs and mosaics depict bound women, their faces often serene in artistic representation, though reality was violent and humiliating. Archaeology confirms this. Amphitheaters, holding pens, and associated burials reveal patterns of trauma consistent with forced movement, exposure, and punishment. Life in the household and life in the public gaze were linked, each reinforcing the other. Medicine followed the logic of utility. Galen, Soranus, and Pliny offered treatments for ailments in childbirth, but slaves received care primarily to preserve productivity. Obstetric interventions were pragmatic, aimed at safe delivery to maintain labor potential. Skeletal analysis supports this. Women bore repeated pregnancies with limited recovery time. Health, like labor, was commodified. Religious life also intersected with daily existence. Some women served in temples, dedicated to rituals or cultic duties. These roles, while sometimes framed as piety, were another form of control. Dedications and inscriptions show slaves assigned to deities or temple property. Religion provided structure but also reinforced legal and social hierarchies. Captive women remained visible as property, whether in domestic, religious, or public spaces. Despite the constraints, acts of agency persisted. Escape, though risky, occurred. Papyri preserve petitions and legal appeals, revealing women who navigated the system to seek temporary relief or permanent freedom. Manumission could change status, but social stigma remained. Freed women often continued work for former masters, established small households, and participated in local economies. Survival required intelligence, patience, and careful negotiation. Archaeology and texts together create a rich picture of these daily lives. In villas across Italy, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, women's labor is preserved in tools, documents, and skeletal evidence. Papyri letters record disputes, assignments, and even social connections. Inscriptions commemorate service, manumission, or household duties. The combination of physical evidence and documents give voice to lives that legal texts had otherwise silenced. Every day was both repetition and negotiation. Women rose with the sun, worked until dusk, endured physical and emotional strain, and navigated the constant threat of punishment. They bore children, cared for households, and sometimes resisted in small ways. Their labor sustained economies, private households, and public spectacles. Their bodies were measured, recorded, and exploited. And yet, within the harsh confines of Roman law and social custom, they found ways to endure, adapt, and sometimes survive. The traces of these lives are visible, yet incomplete. Skeletal remains tell of labor, childbirth, and trauma. Inscriptions and papyri preserve names, transactions, and even occasional acts of resistance. Tools and household implements reveal the scale and intensity of work. Together, they reveal a world of constrained agency, daily labor, and silent endurance, a world where survival required constant vigilance and quiet courage. Chapter 4 illuminates the daily realities of captive women: work, punishment, reproduction, subtle resistance, and adaptation. It shows how Roman law and social expectations shaped life minute by minute. The next chapter will explore sexual exploitation, concubinage, and the moral hypocrisies of elite households, where power, gender, and law intersected to produce some of the harshest consequences for women in captivity.
The walls of Roman villas were silent witnesses. Behind painted frescoes and marble columns, lives were dictated by law, status, and desire. Captive women moved quietly through these spaces, their presence woven into the rhythm of the household. They cooked, cleaned, tended children, but often they also endured the most intimate forms of control. Sexual exploitation was part of daily life. Roman law granted masters authority over the bodies of enslaved women. Concubinage, coerced sexual labor, and household access were legally sanctioned. It was not scandalous to take a captive woman as a concubine. It was a mark of power. Elite writers might discuss morality, but the law and custom endorsed these acts. Tacitus and Suetonius record instances in imperial households, describing how captives were brought into private quarters, sometimes publicly criticized, but rarely restrained. The evidence extends beyond literature. Inscriptions and papyri detail the transactions and assignments of women in households. Some were listed as wet nursings, concubines, or domestic workers. Others were purchased specifically for sexual access. These records often noted age, physical condition, and reproductive potential. Captive women became assets, not only in labor, but in the intimate economy of the household. Osteoarchaeology confirms the consequences. Skeletal remains reveal repeated pregnancies, trauma, and stress markers. Dental wear and bone changes indicate hard labor combined with reproductive strain. The lives of these women were physically and socially regulated, and every movement was observed, measured, and often exploited. The body was a ledger, the womb a commodity. Daily routines intersected with power. Women attended to the needs of children, the elderly, and masters, while simultaneously subjected to sexual demands. They had little recourse. Roman law provided masters with wide latitude. Punishment for resistance was legally permissible. Beatings, forced labor, and restriction of movement were instruments of control. Every act of compliance was enforced through fear and surveillance. Yet resistance persisted. Some women delayed pregnancy, sought intervention from sympathetic authorities, or petitioned for freedom. Papyri show occasional successes, manumission, and small victories. These acts were dangerous, but demonstrated that captive women were not merely passive. Their intelligence, knowledge of law, and social skills were tools in navigating an oppressive environment. Economics and exploitation were inseparable. Sexual access, reproductive labor, and domestic labor all contributed to household wealth. Masters calculated value meticulously. Women's age, skill, and fertility were recorded, monitored, and exploited. Economic calculations dictated who would be retained, sold, or assigned specific roles. Every decision reflected a cold calculus of profit and power. By the end of each day, women's lives were exhausted by labor, control, and surveillance. Yet the traces of humanity persisted. Quiet conversations, shared meals, whispered advice, and subtle acts of defiance. Within the shadow of law, custom, and power, women carved tiny spaces of agency. The household was a microcosm of the empire, hierarchical, calculated, and enforced, but not entirely without resistance. Chapter 5 reveals a harsh truth. Sexual exploitation and domestic labor were intertwined with law, economy, and power. Captive women endured both physical and legal subjugation, yet subtle acts of agency endured. Their lives were measured, observed, and exploited, but intelligence and resilience allowed survival against extraordinary odds. The next chapter will explore resistance, escape, and the rare triumphs of agency, tracing the legal, social, and material evidence of women who navigated the chains of captivity to assert control over their lives.
In the shadowed corners of Roman households, behind locked doors and fenced courtyards, women planned small acts of defiance. Life under captivity was brutal, but it was not entirely without agency. Survival depended on quiet cunning, careful observation, and sometimes daring. The law and the master's power were formidable, but the human spirit found ways to endure. Some women attempted escape. Paths were dangerous, streets patrolled, and borders tightly controlled. Yet archaeological records suggest movement, sudden disappearances from villa inventories, gaps in household lists, and inscriptions marking manumission far from the place of birth. Papyri from Roman Egypt preserve petitions asking for the intervention of magistrates, sometimes documenting women seeking freedom from abusive masters. These documents illustrate not only desperation, but courage, intelligence, and persistence. Resistance also took subtler forms. Some women slowed their labor, deliberately making mistakes that reduced efficiency without provoking immediate punishment. Others feigned illness, hiding the signs of pregnancy or exhaustion to gain temporary reprieve. Knowledge of household routines, who slept when, who controlled keys and access, allowed women to manipulate small spaces of autonomy. Whispered alliances with other women created networks of information and aid. Even small acts of mutual protection helped preserve life and dignity in oppressive conditions. Legal frameworks offered only limited recourse. Roman law codified the rights of masters while giving slaves almost none. Yet petitions, appeals, and occasional manumission indicate that the system could be navigated. Inscriptions commemorate women who achieved freedom, often after decades of labor. Manumission, while rare and controlled, provided tangible proof that survival and strategy could yield results. Freed women still faced social stigma and legal restrictions, but some managed to establish households, care for children, and participate in the local economy. Material evidence sheds light on these acts of agency. Archaeologists have discovered hidden caches of personal items, pins, jewelry, and tokens carefully preserved despite strict household control. These objects suggest that women maintained private identities, small symbols of autonomy and memory. Loom weights and textile remnants sometimes bear subtle markings, perhaps initials or patterns, hinting at self-expression within labor. Even under surveillance, women left traces of individuality. Religious practices provided additional avenues for resistance. Some captive women engaged in cultic activity, not solely as instruments of ritual, but as a means to carve space for themselves. Inscriptions and dedicatory offerings indicate that women sometimes invoked divine protection, sought favors, or marked personal milestones within temple contexts. Religion became a subtle instrument to assert presence, memory, and dignity, even when legal and social systems denied autonomy. Children offered both vulnerability and opportunity. Mothers taught survival skills, work techniques, and social strategies to protect the next generation. They passed down knowledge quietly: how to navigate household hierarchies, how to negotiate with overseers, and when to appeal to law or sympathetic patrons. These acts of transmission were invisible yet powerful, shaping resilience across generations. Status followed the mother, but knowledge and strategy could provide advantages in a system designed to suppress. Public spectacle intersected with resistance in unexpected ways. Captive women in triumphs, games, and processions were exposed to public gaze, but visibility also allowed observation, memory, and documentation. Reliefs and mosaics, while celebrating power, inadvertently recorded details that later helped historians trace the lives and resistance of women. Patterns in amphitheater burials reveal trauma, but also survival, as some women endured punishment and continued to live and work. Visibility, as dangerous as it was, became a tool in memory and agency. Letters and papyri from the first 3 centuries CE provide direct insight into everyday strategies. Women appealed to local officials for protection, petitioned for delayed labor, and documented mistreatment. These acts rarely overthrew the system, but they did create small victories. Even minor successes, being granted time to recover after childbirth, avoiding sale to a harsher master, or securing manumission, were extraordinary. Each petition or appeal represents a deliberate negotiation of power. The elite discourse around morality and slavery provides a stark contrast. Satirical poets, moralists, and philosophers observed, criticized, or lampooned exploitation. Juvenal satirized sexual corruption. Seneca lamented cruelty, but both operated within systems that condoned slavery. For captive women, these debates mattered little in practical terms, but they reveal societal awareness of oppression, hypocrisy, and moral tension. Knowledge of elite critique may have offered women some leverage, whether through alliances or sympathetic intervention. Medical evidence intersects with acts of resistance. Skeletal remains show healed fractures and repeated pregnancies, but also periods of recovery, evidence that some women delayed labor or moderated physical strain. Women's understanding of bodies, health, and childbirth became survival tools. Knowledge of remedies, often transmitted orally or through observation, allowed women to protect themselves and their children, sometimes reducing vulnerability to exploitation. Osteoarchaeology, inscriptions, and material culture together create a portrait of resilience. Women endured forced labor, sexual exploitation, and public humiliation, yet carved spaces of autonomy wherever possible. Every act, from petitioning authorities to concealing personal items, was a calculated maneuver against overwhelming power. These acts remind us that even under extreme oppression, human beings adapt, resist, and assert dignity. The consequences of these small victories extended beyond individual survival. Manumission allowed women to establish households, participate in markets, and raise children with slightly improved conditions. Inscriptions celebrate freed women who became heads of households, dedicated offerings, and maintained family networks. Those constrained by social stigma and legal limitations, freedom enabled tangible changes in social and economic structures. Chapter 6 reveals that resistance was never absent. It was quiet, measured, and often invisible. Escape, petitions, alliances, and cunning negotiation created spaces where captive women could endure and occasionally thrive. Legal, social, and material records illuminate these lives, showing that even in systems designed for total control, the human spirit persisted. The next chapter will explore provincial differences, markets, and the wider economy of captivity, tracing how geography, local customs, and trade networks shaped the experiences of captive women across the Roman Empire. The roads of the Roman Empire were arteries of power, wealth, and human suffering. Captive women traveled along them, carried from one battlefield to another, from conquered towns to bustling markets. The empire's vast geography, cities, ports, and frontier settlements made the trade in women systematic and unrelenting. Each step of the journey reinforced their status as property, yet also created spaces for observation, negotiation, and survival. Markets were the heart of this system. Archaeological excavations in port towns, urban centers, and military camps reveal rows of stalls, scales, and amphorae for trade, but also inscriptions and receipts documenting the sale of human lives. Women were assessed, cataloged, and assigned value according to age, health, skills, and reproductive potential. Papyri from Egypt, accounts from Rome, and inscriptions from North Africa confirm the existence of a highly organized network where captive women were commodities alongside goods, livestock, and land. Urban markets were chaotic and dangerous. Women were displayed like merchandise, examined and appraised by buyers ranging from wealthy elites to middle-class citizens. Legal records codified these transactions. Each sale was permanent, binding, and absolute, leaving the women without choice, their fates decided in the cold arithmetic of property law. Archaeology confirms the physical infrastructure: pens, chains, and spaces for auctions, all designed to control movement and enforce submission. Provincial differences shaped experiences. In Egypt, papyrus preserved details of sales, petitions, and births, providing an intimate view of household assignments and labor expectations. In North Africa, inscriptions reflect integration into local customs, sometimes blending Roman law with Berber and Punic traditions. In Gaul and Britain, archaeology shows adjustments to local economies, textile workshops, domestic labor, and agricultural work adapted to regional needs. Geography determined who worked where, what tasks were assigned, and how women could negotiate limited freedoms. Economic calculations governed every aspect of captive life. Masters measured fertility, labor output, and skills, making decisions about who would be retained, sold, or assigned special duties. Inscriptions and papyri frequently note age, physical condition, and reproductive history. Roman tax records often included inventories of human property, ensuring fiscal accountability. Women's bodies became instruments of economic production, measured, monitored, and optimized for profit. Children of captive women perpetuated the cycle. Status followed the mother. Children were born into bondage, yet maternal knowledge offered protective strategies. Mothers guided daughters in survival, taught practical skills, and sometimes navigated legal avenues to mitigate harsh treatment. Inscriptions of freed women occasionally record children who inherited freedom, illustrating that even in an oppressive system, lineage and knowledge could alter trajectories. Markets were not only economic spaces, they were political and social. Auctions served to demonstrate imperial power after military campaigns. Captive women were paraded during triumphs, displayed as trophies of conquest. Reliefs, coins, and mosaics commemorate these events, simultaneously glorifying military success and normalizing exploitation. Public spectacle and private market intertwined, revealing a society where violence, commerce, and law reinforced each other. Material evidence demonstrates the everyday realities of captive life. Villas, workshops, and farms reveal labor organization, textile production, cooking, childcare, and domestic maintenance. Loom weights, dye pits, and cooking implements correspond to tasks detailed in papyri and inscriptions. Even in labor-intensive work, women sometimes found space for personal expression, subtle marks, and small possessions hidden from view, quiet defiance within a controlled environment. Religion intersected with markets. Some women were assigned to temple service, ritual labor, or dedications, blending sacred obligations with enforced labor. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries and votive offerings shows how captivity could be ritualized, cloaking exploitation in ceremonial legitimacy. Temple records, papyri, and inscriptions document women in cultic roles, adding another layer to the intricate web of control, survival, and limited agency. Resistance persisted amid commerce and control. Escape attempts, petitions, and subtle defiance were common. Papyri from Egypt record women appealing to officials, sometimes successfully delaying sale, obtaining protection, or even gaining freedom. Small victories mattered enormously. Each act of resistance, however minor, was a statement of survival, intelligence, and human endurance. Even within markets, within chains and transactions, women sought to assert presence and agency. Legal structures codified domination, but also inadvertently provided channels for negotiation. Manumission, recorded in inscriptions and papyri, offered rare escapes from permanent bondage. Freed women could establish households, participate in trade, and raise children with improved conditions. While freedom did not erase past suffering, it created new possibilities. Legal, social, and economic systems intersected to constrain, but never fully eliminate human resilience. Elite discourse, both contemporary and later, framed these realities. Satirists, moralists, and philosophers criticized excess and corruption, yet accepted slavery as a norm. Juvenal, Seneca, and others documented abuses without reforming the system. These writings reveal societal awareness of cruelty, providing indirect insight into resistance strategies, alliances, and survival. Women navigated both the physical and ideological landscapes imposed upon them. Archaeology across the empire underscores systemic patterns. Urban centers, frontier settlements, villas, and farms all show consistent forms of labor, punishment, and control. Osteoarchaeology confirms high parity, trauma, and physical stress. Inscriptions and papyri reveal legal documentation, sales, and petitions. Reliefs and mosaics depict public spectacle and private labor. Together, these records create a comprehensive picture of captivity, structured, documented, and enduring. The legacy of captive women extends beyond their immediate lives. Demographic, household structure, and local economies were shaped by their labor and reproductive roles. Children born into bondage altered population structures. Textile production, domestic labor, and specialized skills contributed to regional wealth. Even survival strategies influenced social dynamics, highlighting human agency within oppressive systems. Chapter 7 reveals a profound truth. Captivity was not only personal suffering, it was a structured system embedded in law, economy, culture, and geography. Markets, provinces, and imperial logistics combined to regulate women's lives. Yet within these structures, women resisted, survived, and sometimes triumphed. The empire depended on their labor and bodies, but human ingenuity and resilience quietly persisted. The story of captive women in the Roman Empire is both vast and intimate. From markets to villas, from frontier settlements to temples, their lives were measured, documented, and controlled. Yet traces of agency, survival, and endurance persist in inscriptions, osteology, and material culture. The empire's shadow is long, but so too is the quiet resistance of those it sought to dominate. This concludes the exploration of the lives of captive women, from capture to market to household to rare triumphs of agency. The evidence leaves no room for abstraction. These were real lives shaped by law, economy, and power, but also by courage, cunning, and resilience.